Have you ever spent your whole life feeding others, only to realize no one ever saved a plate for you? I stood in my daughter's kitchen that evening, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the air, the laughter of my grandchildren echoing down the hall. It should have been a moment of joy, a family gathered, a meal shared, love passed from one generation to the next. But love doesn't always taste sweet. Sometimes it comes seasoned with bitterness and silence. I had spent all day helping her, peeling potatoes, basting the roast, setting the table just right like I used to when she was little. Every fork aligned, every napkin folded with care. I even wore the old apron she'd gifted me last Christmas, the one that said "best cook in the family." Funny how titles mean nothing when respect is missing. Dinner was served. The plates clattered, glasses filled, conversations bloomed, but there was no seat for me. "You'll eat after everyone else, Mom," my daughter said, her tone clipped, distracted, as if I were some distant helper, not the woman who had once carried her through sleepless nights and fevers. Her words sliced through me like a cold knife. I smiled to hide the sting, pretending it didn't matter, that I understood, but inside, something shifted, quietly, painfully. You see, neglect doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the smallest moments. A missing chair, an afterthought, a sentence that lingers long after the dishes are cleared. I watched them laugh and eat the roast I'd seasoned with love and memory. Every bite they took felt like a piece of me vanishing. The years of cooking, teaching, giving. And as they ate, I realized something I had never dared to think before. Maybe they didn't see me anymore. Maybe, in their eyes, I was no longer the woman who built their world, but just someone who existed in its corners. When the last plate was cleared and the laughter began to fade, I walked to the kitchen quietly. The leftover roast sat there, golden, tender, still warm. My daughter's voice floated from the other room. "Mom, can you pack what's left for us? We'll have it tomorrow." That's when it happened. I picked up the roast, still steaming with the scent of time and regret, and without a word, I wrapped it in foil, placed it in my old bag, and walked out the door. The cold night air hit my face, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt seen, by myself. Sometimes you don't make a scene. You simply leave one. And that night, as the wind carried the faint hum of their confusion behind me, I realized something every mother learns too late. Love is not just about giving. It's also about knowing when to stop. Because sometimes the only way to feed your soul is to leave them hungry. The story didn't start that night at the dinner table. No, it began many years before, in a small kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and hope. I remember my daughter as a little girl, her tiny fingers tugging at my apron while I stirred the stew. She used to say, "Mom, when I grow up, I want to cook just like you." Those words used to light up my whole world. We didn't have much back then, but we had warmth, the kind that came from long evenings around the table, sharing stories instead of luxuries. I worked 2 jobs to keep her in school, packed her lunches with care, and stayed up late hemming her dresses. Every meal I made was my love letter to her, one she could taste, even if she didn't read it. When her father passed, I thought our bond would only grow stronger. For years, it was just the 2 of us. We built a rhythm. I cooked, she dreamed, and together we carried on. I gave her everything I could. My youth, my savings, my sleep, my laughter. I told myself that's what mothers do. We pour from our cups even when they're empty.
But time changes people. It doesn't always take them far away. Sometimes it just makes them forget who stood behind them. When she got married, I smiled, even though my heart trembled. I wanted her to have what I had lost: love, partnership, a home of her own. She moved to a bigger city, built a life with her husband, and slowly our calls turned from daily to weekly to, "I'll call you soon, Mom." I never complained. I told myself she was busy, that's all. But the silence between us started to feel heavy, like an unspoken truth neither of us wanted to face. When I'd visit, she'd say, "Mom, you don't need to do the dishes." But her tone didn't sound kind. It sounded cautious, like she was afraid I'd touch her world too much. Then came the grandchildren, beautiful, loud, full of life. For a while, I thought they'd bring us closer again. I'd cook for them, tell them bedtime stories, and watch their faces light up like my daughters once did. But soon I realized I was more of a visitor in their lives than family. They'd call me Grandma, but they didn't really know me. I was there to babysit, to serve, to fill the silence when needed. The last time I went over before that dinner, I'd brought her favorite dish, the roast I'd made every Sunday when she was young. I remember her opening the door, surprised. "Oh, Mom, you didn't have to cook. We ordered takeout." She smiled politely, but her eyes darted to the roast like it was an inconvenience. That's when I first felt it, the faint sting of being unwanted in the spaces I built with love. Still, I kept showing up. I kept cooking. I kept hoping, because mothers do that. We believe that if we love hard enough, it will be enough to bring them back. So when she called that morning asking me to come help her prepare dinner for a small gathering, my heart leapt. She said, "It's just a family thing, Mom. Could you make that roast you used to make? The kids love it." I smiled through the phone, not realizing that it wasn't love that made her call me. It was convenience. When I arrived that afternoon, she was already busy, dressed in something elegant, hair tied perfectly. "You can start the roast," she said, handing me the ingredients without even meeting my eyes. The kitchen felt colder that day, like it didn't belong to me. Still, I cooked because that's what I do. The sound of sizzling oil, the smell of herbs, they reminded me of all the times I'd made that same meal in a house full of laughter and dreams. Except this time, I was only a ghost moving through the motions of the past. As I basted the roast, I looked out the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I thought about how many sunsets I'd watched alone, waiting for her to call. How many birthdays I'd spent by myself, convincing my heart that her love was still there. Just busy, just delayed. But love delayed too long becomes love forgotten. The table was set beautifully that night. Candles, flowers, linen napkins folded like swans. I remember thinking, this is what I taught her. The elegance, the care, the pride in presentation, all pieces of me. Yet when dinner began, I realized something had shifted beyond repair. As everyone gathered around, there was no seat for me. Not one. I looked around, smiling awkwardly, waiting for her to notice. But she didn't. She just poured the wine and laughed at her husband's jokes. That's when she turned to me, almost casually, and said, "You'll eat after everyone else, Mom." For a moment, I thought I misheard. But no one else seemed surprised. Not one person looked my way. The room was full of chatter, but I couldn't hear any of it. Just the echo of her words. After everyone else. And that's when something in me went still. Not angry, not sad, just still. Because sometimes silence isn't a weakness. It's the sound of something breaking. Quietly, completely. That night, I realized this wasn't just about dinner. It was about every moment she made me feel small, every time she forgot the woman who raised her. But she didn't know, not yet, that I had one final meal to serve. When you live long enough, silence becomes your second language. You learn to read the things people don't say, the hesitation in their voice, the way their eyes look past you when they speak. That night, after my daughter told me I'd eat after everyone else, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even frown. I just nodded and went back to the kitchen, pretending to check the roast. But inside, my heart trembled like the old glass window above the sink, barely holding together under the pressure. I could hear them laughing in the dining room, her friends, her husband, even the children. Their voices overlapped like music I used to love but no longer understood. I caught pieces of conversation, travel plans, new furniture, and promotions. Not once did anyone ask, "Where's Grandma?" I stared at the roast, golden, perfect, tender, the kind that melts in your mouth and brings back memories you thought you'd forgotten. I thought of how many times I'd made that very dish, how it once symbolized love, celebration, togetherness. Tonight, it was just meat, soulless, silent, like the space I'd been pushed into. I remember the first time I taught her how to make it. She was 12, standing on a stool because she could barely reach the counter. "Always season with your heart," I told her. "That's the secret." She'd giggled, sprinkling salt like fairy dust, proud of her creation. That day, she hugged me and said, "Mom, I'll never forget this." But she did. She forgot the secret. She forgot that food isn't about recipes. It's about care, about serving love, not hierarchy. The more I watched her that evening, the clearer it became. Somewhere along the way, my daughter stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as an obligation, not a person with feelings, but a shadow who showed up to help, to clean, to serve, to fill a chair only when needed. When did love turn into pity? When did respect turn into convenience? I used to think age would earn me peace, that after years of sacrifice, my reward would be warmth, laughter, maybe a little gratitude. But what age really gives you is clarity. And clarity hurts. It strips the illusions clean off the memories you've painted with love. You begin to see the cracks in the foundation you built, the unspoken resentments that grew while you weren't looking. I thought about how she used to cling to me when she was afraid of thunder, how she'd crawl into my bed and whisper, "Don't ever leave me, Mom." I'd stroke her hair and promise, "Never, sweetheart, never." And I didn't. I stayed through every storm, every heartbreak, every mistake. I was there, even when she didn't want me to be. But tonight, sitting in her kitchen, my hands trembling, my heart aching, I realized she had already left me long ago. The clinking of glasses in the next room snapped me back. I looked at the clock. Dinner had begun. My roast, my gift, my gesture, was now just a centerpiece on their table, one I was excluded from. I wiped my hands on my apron and leaned against the counter. A strange calm settled over me, not the kind that comes from acceptance, but the kind that comes from awakening. I thought about all the mothers who sit in quiet rooms, waiting for their children to visit, the ones who cook meals that no one eats, who replay memories in their minds just to remember what love used to feel like. I wasn't alone. I knew that. There were countless women like me, unseen, unheard, slowly fading into the background of their children's lives. But tonight, I didn't want to fade. As I listened to their laughter, I wondered, when did I stop existing in her story? Was it when I retired and stopped contributing financially? Was it when she built her own home and thought I no longer had a place? Or was it when I stopped being needed? Need and love. I used to think they were the same thing, but they're not. Love sees you even when you're not useful. Love doesn't keep score, doesn't relegate you to the background once you've given all you can.
Love, real love, has space for you, always. A small tear slipped down my cheek, but I wiped it quickly. I didn't want to give that moment power. I had already given enough. Then I looked at the roast again. It sat there, steaming gently, the scent filling the room. It was beautiful, too beautiful to be served to people who saw me as an afterthought. For a fleeting second, I thought about leaving it there. Let them have their feast. But then another thought whispered in my mind, quiet but sharp. What if I took it? What if, for once, I didn't give them what they expected? It wasn't about revenge. No, it was something deeper, a need to reclaim something I had lost a long time ago. My worth, my dignity, my say. The idea felt wild at first, childish even, but the longer I stood there, the more it made sense. That roast wasn't just food. It was a symbol of everything I had poured into this family. My time, my patience, my love. And if they couldn't value me, then they didn't deserve the fruits of my labor. So I waited. I waited until their laughter softened into the gentle hum of dinner conversation. I waited until I was sure no one would come into the kitchen. Then, slowly, I lifted the tray. It was heavy, but not as heavy as the years I'd carried them on my back. I grabbed my coat, slipped on my shoes, and walked out the door. The cold air hit my face, sharp and freeing. I could still hear their voices faintly through the walls, unaware. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt alive. I placed the roast carefully in the passenger seat of my old car, as if it were a friend keeping me company. The smell filled the space, warm and comforting. I started the engine and drove off into the night, not knowing exactly where I was going, but knowing exactly what I was leaving behind. As the road stretched ahead, I thought about the years I had spent cooking for people who no longer tasted the love in my food, about all the times I had stayed silent to keep the peace, about the countless apologies I had whispered just for existing too loudly in the spaces I helped build. And for the first time, I laughed, a small, shaky laugh that turned into tears, because freedom, it turns out, doesn't always come from leaving home. Sometimes it comes from taking the roast and walking away. But as I drove, a thought lingered in my mind, like a shadow I couldn't shake. What would they do when they realized? Would my daughter finally understand what she had lost? Would they sit around that beautiful table hungry and finally taste the absence I had been feeling all these years? I didn't know. All I knew was that tonight they would eat silence. And maybe, just maybe, silence would finally feed them the truth. The city lights looked different that night, softer somehow, like they were welcoming me back to a world I'd forgotten. I drove without a destination, the roast still warm beside me, the smell of rosemary and garlic mixing with the scent of old leather and freedom. It was strange how something as simple as leaving could feel so powerful. For years, I've been told what I could and couldn't do. You shouldn't drive at night, Mom. You'll get tired. Just rest. We'll handle it. Every instruction was a kindness wrapped in control. And I accepted it. Because that's what mothers do. We don't want to be a burden, so we shrink ourselves into gratitude. But tonight, I didn't want to be grateful. I wanted to be alive. As the tires hummed against the road, memories began to surface. Fragments of a woman I used to be before motherhood swallowed me whole. I remember dancing barefoot in the rain with my husband before he passed. I remember painting in the old shed, losing track of time. I remembered being bold, curious, untamed. When did I trade all that in for quiet obedience? At some point, I pulled over by the lake. The moonlight glimmered on the surface, and the air smelled like wet soil and pine. I stepped out, still holding the tray. Absurd, really, standing there in my Sunday dress with a roast in hand. But it felt symbolic, almost sacred. I placed the tray on a picnic table and sat across from it. The steam rose slowly, fading into the night sky. "Well," I whispered, "it's just you and me now." The wind rustled through the trees, almost like a reply. I smiled sadly. "You've been the witness to everything, haven't you? The laughter, the tears, the birthdays, and now this." As I sat there, I thought about what the roast really meant. It wasn't just dinner. It was devotion. It was every unspoken "I love you" I'd ever served on a plate, every apology I made with food instead of words, every "I forgive you" that came with dessert. And tonight, for the first time, that devotion was mine again. I took a small bite, warm, tender, rich. It tasted different, maybe because for once I wasn't serving anyone else. It hit me then, hard and clear. I had been feeding everyone but myself. Not just food, but time, patience, energy, dreams. I had poured my whole self into others until there was nothing left to nourish me. And when I finally looked around, the table was full, but my plate was empty. That realization burned deeper than any insult. Because isn't that what happens to so many women? We spend decades nurturing others, and when we finally stop, they call us selfish. They forget that even the strongest hearts need refilling. I laughed softly, shaking my head. Maybe I should have taken the roast a long time ago, I said to no one. The stars were sharp and bright, like tiny reminders that even the smallest light matters. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up sewing my daughter's dresses, the mornings I'd skipped breakfast to make sure she had lunch. I believed that love meant giving endlessly. But love isn't martyrdom. Love has boundaries, or it becomes servitude. I don't know how long I sat there, an hour, maybe two, long enough for the food to cool and my thoughts to settle. Somewhere between the silence and the moonlight, a decision root. I wasn't going back. Not tonight, maybe not ever. They would learn what it meant to miss me, not out of guilt, but out of awareness, out of respect. I started the car again and drove until the lake disappeared behind me. The road stretched ahead, dark and unfamiliar. For once, the unknown didn't scare me. It thrilled me. When I reached the next town, I found a small motel by the roadside, the kind with flickering signs and tired clerks. The man behind the counter looked up as I entered, his eyes soft with curiosity. "Traveling alone, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes," I said simply. "Just me." He smiled. "Good for you. Not many do that anymore." He handed me the key and I went to my room, small, plain, but clean. I set the roast on the little table by the window and sat on the bed. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. That night I slept better than I had in years.
The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, golden and new.
I opened the window, letting in the crisp air. I made myself a cup of coffee from the machine by the sink, and as I sipped, I smiled. No one told me how to drink it. No one told me when. It was mine, all of it. Still, my thoughts wandered home. I wondered what they'd said when they discovered I was gone. Maybe they thought I'd gone for a walk. Maybe they laughed it off at first, but then, when they saw the empty table, the missing roast, I wondered if silence finally fell across that room. I pictured my daughter standing there, stunned, her husband checking the oven, the children whispering. And in that quiet, maybe, just maybe, they realized something they'd forgotten. That I wasn't just their helper or background presence, I was the reason that house felt like home. I could almost hear her voice in my head, "Mom, Mom, where are you?" Funny how people only remember your worth when it's no longer at their table. Later that day, I stopped by a small diner for lunch. The waitress, a cheerful young woman with tired eyes, asked if I was passing through. I told her a little of my story. Not everything, just enough to make her pause. "You really left?" she asked, incredulous. "I did," I said with a small smile. "I took my roast and went." She laughed, not mockingly, but with a kind of admiration. "I don't know if I could ever do that." "You will," I said softly. "When you've given enough of yourself away, you'll know. And when you do, don't apologize." Something in her eyes changed then, like she was seeing her own future or her mother's in mine. We talked a while about family, about dreams, about how women often disappear in the noise of everyone else's needs. Before I left, she leaned closer and whispered, "I'm going to visit my mom tonight. Haven't seen her in months." That made me smile all the way back to the car. It's strange how one small act, walking away, can ripple into the lives of others. Like dropping a pebble in still water, the waves just keep spreading. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in orange and pink, I realized something else. I wasn't running away. I was returning to myself. The roast was nearly gone now, but I saved one last piece. I wanted to keep it as a reminder of that night, the night I stopped being invisible. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, that didn't frighten me. I was free. And yet, beneath that freedom, a quiet question lingered, whispering at the edge of my mind. Would they understand? Would my daughter come looking for me, not to bring me back, but to truly see me? The thought both comforted and haunted me, because sometimes people only see you clearly when your absence is louder than your presence. I turned on the radio as I drove again, an old love song playing softly. I hummed along, my voice trembling but steady. Out there, under the vast open sky, I felt the tiniest flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, hope. But little did I know, the silence I left behind was about to shake more than one heart awake. And that was only the beginning. Morning light poured through the kitchen window, stretching across the table that had always been the center of our lives. But today, it looked different, colder. The platters were empty, the plates untouched. The smell of rosemary still lingered faintly in the air, mocking them like a memory of something warm that had turned to ash.
"Where's Mom?" my daughter asked, her voice tight. She stood at the head of the table, staring at the space where the roast should have been. Her husband shrugged.
Too quickly? She probably went to her room, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. The youngest grandchild, little Ellie, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Is Grandma mad at us?" The question hung in the air like smoke. No one answered. When they checked my room and found the bed neatly made, my bag gone, and the car missing, the truth started to sink in. "She left," my daughter whispered, disbelief cracking her voice. "She actually left!" The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Across town, I was sitting in a diner booth, sipping coffee and reading the paper. The world felt larger, brighter, full of possibilities. I watched people rush in and out, laughter mingling with the clatter of plates. For once, I wasn't invisible. The waitress smiled at me every time she passed, and that small acknowledgement felt like sunlight. I thought of my family, how they must have been reacting at that very moment. Part of me wanted to feel guilty, but I didn't. Not this time. Because for years, I'd been sitting at tables where love was measured by convenience, not respect. I'd been told I was helpful, sweet, selfless. They said it like compliments, but they were really chains. And when I finally broke them, I didn't hear the sound of shattering. I heard the sound of freedom. Back home, my daughter sat on the porch, staring out at the driveway. Her husband was pacing. The kids were unusually quiet. "She took the car and the roast. Who does that?" She shot him a glare that could have cut glass. "Don't talk about her like that." Her voice trembled, with guilt, with fear, maybe even shame. She didn't want to admit it aloud, but deep down, she knew exactly why I left. All those little moments, the dismissive comments, the half laughs when I forgot something, the way she'd roll her eyes when I offered advice, it all added up. And then last night, the sentence that broke me: "You'll eat after everyone else." At the time, she hadn't even thought about it. It was a careless command said in passing, something meant to keep things in order. But now, replaying it in her mind, she realized how cruel it sounded, how cold, how final. "Mom," she whispered to the empty driveway, "what have I done?" Meanwhile, I drove through familiar roads that felt foreign now. Every landmark carried a memory, some sweet, some bittersweet. The grocery store where I'd held her hand as a little girl, the school where I'd waited in the rain for her, the park where we'd once shared sandwiches and secrets. I pulled over by that park. It was empty this time of year, the benches damp with morning dew. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, and thought about what motherhood really meant. No one teaches you that love has expiration dates, not the feeling itself, but the form it takes. When your children grow up, they stop needing you the way they used to, and if you're not careful, you forget how to need yourself. That's the silent heartbreak of being a mother. You spend so long being essential that when the world moves on, you have no idea who you are without it. But as I watched the sunlight ripple through the trees, something softened inside me. Maybe this wasn't the end of my story, just the next chapter. By afternoon, my daughter was calling everyone, neighbors, friends, even the police. "She's not answering her phone," she said to the dispatcher, her voice breaking. "She's never done anything like this." The officer was calm. "Ma'am, your mother is an adult. If she left willingly, she's not missing. She's just gone somewhere she wanted to be." That sentence hit her harder than she expected. Gone somewhere she wanted to be.
When was the last time she'd let her mother want anything for herself? That night, after putting the kids to bed, she sat in the kitchen alone. The house felt too quiet, too heavy. She noticed the framed photo on the counter, one from years ago when she was still a child. In it, her mother was smiling, holding her close. There was a spark in her eyes, a glow that had long since dimmed. Tears blurred her vision. "Where did I lose you?" she whispered. But the truth was, she hadn't lost me overnight. She'd lost me slowly, in 1,000 little ways. When she stopped calling me for advice because Google knows faster.
When she started sighing at my stories, when she stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me only as a convenience. And that realization cracked something open in her heart. A few days later, I was still in that little town. I'd found a quiet rhythm, morning walks, coffee at the diner, small talk with strangers. People greeted me by name. I hadn't felt this visible in decades. One afternoon, I met an older woman at the park. Her name was Dolores. She wore a red scarf and carried a notebook filled with poems. "I left my family too," she said, almost conspiratorially. 2 years ago. They called me dramatic, but now they visit me every Sunday, out of respect, not obligation. We laughed together, 2 women bonded by the strange rebellion of rediscovering ourselves. I used to think leaving meant giving up, I told her, but maybe it means finally showing up for yourself. She nodded. Exactly. Sometimes love has to go missing before it's noticed. Her words echoed in me long after we parted. Back home, the silence stretched into the second week. My daughter tried to cook the same roast I used to make, but it didn't taste right. Too much salt, not enough patience. "Grandma always made it better," little Ellie said. Her mother swallowed hard. "I know, sweetheart." Later that night, she sat at the kitchen table again, staring at her phone. Finally, she opened her messages and typed, "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Please come home. I miss you." She hit send, then waited. No reply. The screen stayed dark. But what she didn't know was that I'd seen the message. I'd read it 3 times, tears slipping down my face, not out of anger, but release. Because for the first time, she'd said please. Not as a command, not as an expectation, but as a daughter reaching for her mother again. I didn't reply right away. Some silences have to linger long enough to teach their lesson. Over the next few weeks, my daughter began to change. She started calling her own children thank you and please more often. She let them help in the kitchen instead of ordering them around. She even visited her neighbor, an elderly widow, and brought her soup. She was learning, slowly, painfully, what love without gratitude becomes. And though she didn't know it, that was my lesson all along. Sometimes absence isn't punishment. It's a mirror. One morning, I woke up to a knock on the door of my motel room. I hesitated, heart pounding. When I opened it, she was standing there. My daughter. Her eyes were swollen, her hair unkempt, her hands trembling. She looked smaller somehow. "Mom," she breathed. We stared at each other, 2 women who had hurt and healed each other in equal measure. "I brought breakfast," she said, lifting a paper bag. "Your favorite, blueberry muffins." I smiled faintly. "You remembered." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I remember everything." We sat on the edge of the bed, sharing muffins in silence.
She kept glancing at me like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't mean what I said that night. I was just tired." "I know," I said softly, "but tiredness doesn't excuse cruelty." Her tears spilled over them. "I thought I was helping, keeping things organized. I didn't realize I was pushing you out of your own family." I reached for her hand. "You weren't just pushing me out, sweetheart. You were teaching your children that love has ranks, that some people eat first and others wait. I couldn't let that be my legacy." She nodded, sobbing quietly.
"I'm sorry, Mom. I know you are," I whispered, "but now you understand. That's enough." We finished our muffins, and for the first time in years, we just talked. Really talked about life, about love, about how easy it is to lose sight of gratitude when comfort takes over. When she left later that day, she hugged me tightly and said, "Next Sunday, dinner's at my place. You eat first." I laughed softly. "We'll see." That evening, I sat by the motel window watching the sunset. The sky was streaked with gold and violet, colors of closure and renewal. I didn't know if I'd move back home. Maybe I would. Maybe I wouldn't. But one thing was certain. They'd never forget that night. They'd never forget the empty table, the missing roast, the silence that finally made them listen. Sometimes it takes hunger, not of the body, but of the heart, to teach people the value of what truly feeds them. And in the end, I realized something I wish I'd known sooner. Love isn't proven by how much you give. It's proven by how much others see when you finally stop giving. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of my life changed in quiet but extraordinary ways. I found myself waking up to the sound of birds instead of alarms, cooking only for myself, and realizing how peaceful silence could be when it wasn't wrapped in obligation. There was no one to serve, no one to ask, "Do you want more tea?" Or, "Is the roast done yet?" It was strange at first, almost uncomfortable, as though I'd stepped into an empty theater after everyone had gone home. But slowly, I began to see the beauty in it. The world outside my old life was still vast and waiting, and I had forgotten what it meant to exist without being needed. One morning, while sitting at the diner, Dolores looked up from her newspaper and said, "You look lighter these days." I smiled. "Maybe because I've stopped carrying everyone else's expectations." She laughed softly, stirring her coffee. "That's the secret, isn't it? They say motherhood is forever, but sometimes it's okay to take the apron off." Her words lingered in my chest long after we said goodbye. I began to understand that freedom in old age isn't about running away. It's about returning to yourself. All my life, I'd been defined by titles: daughter, wife, mother, grandmother. Beautiful words, yes, but each came with invisible weight. I had lived years believing that love meant sacrifice, that being selfless was a virtue. But what no one told me was that being too selfless eventually erases the self entirely. The more I sat with that truth, the clearer it became. People only value what they're reminded of and can be lost. My daughter didn't realize what my presence meant until it vanished. My family didn't see the heart that fed them until the table stood empty. But I wasn't angry anymore. In fact, I was strangely grateful, because sometimes pain has to open the door for wisdom to walk in. I thought often about that night, her words, "You'll eat after everyone else," and the way they echoed deeper than she ever intended. They weren't just about food, they were about place, about hierarchy. They reminded me of every woman who had ever been told to wait her turn, to stand quietly behind others while they feasted on her effort. I realized I wasn't just leaving dinner that night. I was leaving a legacy of silence. And perhaps that's what this chapter of life was truly about. Not revenge,
Not even rebellion, but revelation. The revelation that age doesn't mean the end of choices, that growing older doesn't mean shrinking smaller, that boundaries are not selfishness, but a language of self-respect. Some evenings, I still thought about returning home. The house was full of memories, yes, but it was also full of ghosts. Not the haunting kind, but the kind built from years of being unseen. I wasn't sure if I could walk through those halls again without feeling the weight of every unspoken thank you. Yet, I knew someday I might visit, not to stay, but to show them what I had learned. The letters from my daughter began arriving weekly. Each one softer than the last. She wrote about her children, about how she was trying to teach them gratitude, how she'd started volunteering at the local shelter. "You were right," she wrote once. "Love isn't about control, it's about care." Another time she said, "I used to think strength meant doing everything. Now I think it means listening." I kept her letters in a shoebox beneath my bed. Sometimes I read them late at night, and tears would sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from a tender sort of pride. Because even though the wound between us had taken time to heal, it had taught both of us something rare. Love, when tested, can return stronger if both hearts are willing to learn. There was something else I hadn't expected, the quiet companionship of other women my age who began sharing their stories. Dolores introduced me to a group that met every Thursday at the library.
Widows, retirees, grandmothers, and even a few divorced women starting over. We'd sit around with tea and laughter, and though our lives were different, our stories were echoes of one another. Each of us had once been told we were too old or too soft or too late. Each of us had believed it until we didn't. One woman, Ruth, says something that stayed with me. People think old age is about losing things, but maybe it's about shedding what was never truly yours to keep. We all went quiet after that, letting her words settle like dust in the sunlight. That night, I walked home under a sky heavy with stars, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small beneath it. I felt infinite, like all the versions of myself that had been buried under years of service were finally rising to the surface again. The woman who used to sing while cooking, who used to dance barefoot in the kitchen when no one was watching, was still there. She had just been waiting for permission to exist again. I realized something else too, that my story wasn't unique. It was the story of countless mothers and grandmothers who'd given everything, only to be told their value had an expiration date. But the truth is, love doesn't fade with wrinkles. Purpose doesn't end when children grow up. A heart that has loved deeply carries more strength than any youth could ever know. In the end, I learned that forgiveness isn't about excusing the hurt, it's about freeing yourself from it. I forgave my daughter not because she asked, but because holding on would have chained me to the very pain I'd escaped. And in forgiving her, I forgave myself too, for staying silent so long, for confusing endurance with love. Sometimes I imagine that dinner table again, this time set with warmth, laughter, and gratitude. My daughter is sitting beside me, her children helping serve. No ranks, no waiting, just family sharing space with respect. That's the world I hope for them, the legacy I want to leave. Because at the end of the day, it was never about the roast or the dinner or the house. It was about dignity, about realizing that love without respect is starvation disguised as comfort, about finally understanding that self-worth isn't earned through sacrifice, it's remembered through self-honor.